Great. Okay, you should be able to see my screen. Ignore all of the things that are kind of everywhere. But yeah, hi guys. My name is Velina. I will be doing a workshop on how to do extensions. Please never mind any grammatical or like just English mistakes that I have done in the slides. I don't have Grammarly currently, and that has been really messing with me. Yeah, but just in general, a little bit like 2-3 words about myself, because I just think it's helpful that you kind of know who I am if you don't know, kind of introducing myself. So I have been engaged in debating for like around 5 years now. I started in high school, and I started with BP in high school. It is very prominent in the Bulgarian circuit. I am from Bulgaria. And yeah, it has been kind of my passion for a while. I won EUDC in 2023, and I am currently CAing EUDC 2025 that is going to happen in the next couple of weeks. So very excited about that. Otherwise, I have an open break at Worlds. And I don't know, something else about myself. I really like soap operas. Like if this can be one thing about me. Sorry, I have just been binging, the past couple of hours, and I thought that was a relevant thing to say, just to humanize me. I am a person. I am not just a talking head on the screen. Yeah, but basically what we are going to chat through today, there is an agenda that I don't think I edited. So I'm just going to tell you what we kind of are going to do. Firstly, I'm going to go through terminology and basics just about extensions. Then we're going to dive a little bit more into what the goals of any extension is, and kind of trying to break them up a little bit. We're going to talk about how to brainstorm. We are going to also talk about how to kind of try to figure out what the debate is about so you can strategically position your extension. And then I'm also, I think, at a certain part in this presentation, I'm going to talk about burdens and kind of how to construct arguments. And because that's the issue with extensions, right? This is kind of a workshop that I need to cover basically everything there is about debating, because they're just everything that you need to do within debate, you need to do in an extension. So you should be able to identify the right argument to run. You should be able to understand the clashes of the debate. You should be able to track the debate in the top half. You also should be able to kind of build the argument in a certain way. And so, like, kind of, I'm going to try to run through everything within this presentation, which is a little bit hard, of course. Not everything is going to be discussed in detail. And so throughout the course of this presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share you some documents with you. Outside of those slides, I'm going to share you another presentation that I have done on extensions, and then I'm going to send you a document that I have of how to build arguments, because I just think it's helpful for you to have it. That said, there are other 2 workshops that are recorded. I think only one is uploaded of me talking about extensions. I think if you at any point don't understand something, because I'm kind of running through things here, you can either like watch any of the other 2. I am going to bug somebody about uploading the second one. But the reason why there are 2 other recorded workshops of me about extension, why I keep on giving this workshop, is because my understanding of extensions evolves. My ability to explain to you how to do extensions also evolves with time. And I think that every workshop has been, there has been an additional build-up on how exactly to do extensions. And the last 2 bits that I want to say. The first one is I'm going to try to end within like 45 minutes to an hour. You can interrupt me whenever. You can text in the chat, but I might not be able to like respond right away if I don't see that there is a message in the chat. If you want, you can unmute yourself and just ask me a question. Really, again, that's why I told you like a personal fact about me, that I really like watching soap operas. So you know that I'm a person and you can engage with me and you shouldn't be scared of me. And of course, in the end, I'm just going to give you some time for questions if you just want to chat through it. Then I am not sure how interactive this presentation is going to be on my end, so how much questions I am asking you. I'm going to try to ask you as much as possible, but again, just for the time limits and the extent of content that I need to cover here, it might not be the most interactive presentation that you have had. And last and final bit, I tend to be stronger as a speaker on closing half than I am in opening half. I am an extension speaker, and that's kind of what I pride myself with, is that I very typically come up with the extension, and I am very confident that my speech is a speech that kind of convinces the judge that the extension wins. And that's kind of my philosophy about extensions. If you do not necessarily from the extension speech explain as to why this is an important contribution to the debate, it's very rarely that you're going to place very highly. The extension speaker is the one that kind of single-handedly needs to explain as to why the judge even needs to consider the idea that you can win the debate. And then the whip, of course, explain exactly how you win the debate. But the judge already kind of needs to get convinced that you have the capacity to win this debate. And that's why kind of extension speeches are very tricky, because there is a little bit more room for failure than it is on top half. Of course, some of the most basic ideas and intuitions are taken by top half, but that does not necessarily mean that they're not benefits. So from back half specifically, what you can do is you can think much more about the motion. You can see how kind of the debate plays out, and specifically, you can intersect the debate. You have seen what happens in the top half. You can enter the debate and explain to the judge as to why you kind of solve a problem that exists. Because it's very rare that the top half teams are going to be 100% perfect in the way that they explain things, that they're not going to have a certain deadlock on the clashes that they're arguing. And that's why it's so helpful to have an extension speaker who can just kind of intersect the debate. And that's why also back half is very beneficial, because you just have more time to think about this. You have more time to come up with new ideas and new ways in which you can do it. Of course, there are very many downsides, such as, you're not the first people that are speaking in the debate, and the most intuitive things are already taken, but that doesn't mean that there are not upsides to this. That's kind of why back half exists in the first place. Yeah, but I think I'm done with the intro yapping, and I can actually get to the presentation, which is firstly on terminology and basics. So you can hear a lot of words around extensions. So we have vertical extensions, we have horizontal extensions, but those things actually mean something, and I just want to dig a little bit what exactly an extension is, and then what are those types of extensions that you might very often hear about. So extensions in BP can be can be like any other argument made. They're not necessarily different than what the top half speakers are doing. So the types of arguments that are done are the same. The structure is the same. The difference can be just the value of the structure. The only thing that kind of can change is in analysis extension, and I'll get to that in a second. But basically, everything else is just a argument that you make. So analysis extension, this is one of the very basic ideas, that the top half teams are going to run an argument. This argument is going to be flawed, and then you're going to fix this flaw. So it is filling in gaps that the opening half has had. And very often, in order for an analysis extension to be successful, it needs to fill an important gap within the debate. So you not only need to, say, oh, maybe opening government missed this piece of characterization, but you need to explain as to why this piece of characterization is so groundbreaking to the debate, and how the engagement of this argument coming from opening government changes significantly with this characterization, so they're able to take over opening opposition. Here I want to put an asterisk. With analysis extensions, however much opening is reliant on you, because, for example, they have missed a burden of change, they have not explained as to why specifically things change on their side of the house, or they have missed the alternative as to why their side of the house is significantly different than what the status quo is. They are reliant on the analysis that is going to come in the extension, but you're also vice versa reliant on everything else that they have said. And there is a little bit trickiness to this, because some judges might perceive this as not a full argument, and thus not credit it as such, and not put you over opening government in the instance that you're closing government. Some judges might not have this problem. And so with analysis extensions, it's always helpful to not only have filled in this one gap that opening government has, but also have a complete line of logic, thus have built an argument around this. Meaning that you're probably reaching a very similar outcome than what opening government has said, but you're much more particular because of that piece of missing characterization, or because of the delta of the debate, which has increased the scope of your argument, so it affects more people on a greater level, right? And so that's kind of what it is with analysis extensions. Now, I know that wasn't only terminology, it was also a lot about how analysis extensions look like, but I think it's just a helpful way of thinking about them. There is a subset of analysis extensions, which are vertical extensions. Now, vertical extensions are running the same, not necessarily the same argument, but a very similar argument to what opening government has already said. And this is not necessarily based on the idea that opening government or opening opposition, for that matter, has made a type of mistake, has missed a burden, but more so you have thought of other ways to reach the same impact. For example, if there is a motion about this house will remove the minimum wage, and opening government has said that this leads to the creation of more jobs because companies have more capital to employ more people. This is their line of logic. You can try from closing government to reach the same impact, which is employment of more people, but to reach it in another way. It is not because companies have more money, but it is because now companies are not going to automate. So, for example, this can be an argument that if there is a minimum wage, companies much more prefer to employ AI or integrate some type of machinery or robotics because they just become cheaper than the minimum wage. Now that we remove the minimum wage, we create an extra incentive for companies to employ more people. Now, if you think about it long enough, by the way, the two lines of logic between opening government of what I have outlined and closing government are largely the same because it's cheaper for companies to employ you. But the core characterization around it is much different. In one case, it's just companies don't have money, maybe they don't make the same amount of profit. In the other cases, there is a specific problem in the status quo, which is automation. Giving a couple of reasons as to why this is the case. You know, we have the computing power, we have a very big trend. Companies want to jump in on this trend, makes them more competitive. Because of all of those AI companies, this has decreased the price of AI, and so a lot of companies can opt into it. And so you have given very specific characterization of what the problem is that is different than what the problem of opening government is outlining. And then you explain as to why it's cheaper for companies. And while the mechanism of change is the same, you're just bringing much more context to it. And then it's reaching the same impact just in a different way. Or the impact can be slightly different. You might not only claim that there are more jobs, but you can claim that this is going to lead to general growth in the economy. So you're a little bit more macro with the impact. Now, this doesn't mean that the argument is basically not the same. It just means that you're reaching the same outcome in a different way. Vertical extensions, or at least from what I have seen, have become very prominent in the past couple of years. A lot of people opt in to run the same argument just with different reasons. And here I just want to put an asterisk on this, which is it is very often that opening teams are going to go for the most intuitive reasoning for the most intuitive argument, just because of the time constraint and just because the motion probably feeds them some type of information that they're going to use. And not all instances, this most intuitive argumentation of proving the most intuitive argument that you might attempt to prove again on CG is the best, but in very many cases it is. It's just more believable, it's very contemporary, so it fits with the status quo very good. The judge is going to buy it. It's just how kind of debates are constructed. That's kind of why opening government exists as a position, so they can take the low-hanging fruit, not only in terms of argument, but also in terms of reasoning as to why the argument is correct. There are instances in which this is not the case. Opening government can be incredibly vague because they didn't have enough time to prep it. They might miss a very important piece of context about this argument. They might place set the argument in a different context than the most influential one. For example, if opening government on the motion about minimum wage, sorry that I'm using such a basic example, it's just very easy to make very quick examples with it. So if we have the minimum wage argument from opening government, they might place it in industries such as blue-collar industries, but not specifically talk about the types of countries within which it happens. And then from closing government, although you're using the same line of argumentation, you might place it in the developing world. And you can also divide the developing world in parts. You can have the developing world in Asia, you can have the developing world in Africa, all of those things. And then you're much more specific about the type of outcome. There is a second asterisk to this. If you're doing this, you need to be very clear on what the difference between you and opening government is, or opening opposition in that case, in like other cases. You need to be able to explain to the judge as to why those arguments, although they reach similar outcomes / the same outcomes, should be valued as different, and one thing is not derivative of the other. And for that, and I'm going to mention this a little bit later in the presentation as well, you need to be able to track your opening team to a very good extent. You need not only to understand the argument that they're running, but the specific reasons and the wording of the specific reasons that they have given. And you need to be able to feed that back to the judge with the wording that they have said and explain as to why it is different than what you have said. Because if you don't do it, it's very easy for the judge to go, you're derivative, especially in situation, again, where there is no gap to fill in opening government. It's just you're running the same case just a little bit differently. You need to be very particular about this. But again, a little bit more on that will come in a second. Second type of very big, broad type of extension is horizontal extension. So this is basically just a completely new argument. A completely new argument not only means that the reasoning for the argument is different, but also the outcome of the argument is different. So the type of impact that you're trying to reach is completely different. It's not connected to jobs, it's not connected to the economy, but it's going to claim a third thing, maybe even on another clash. With this house will remove the minimum wage motion. There are very limited arguments that I think can be run on both sides. So I don't think that I can come up with a very persuasive example of what exactly a new argument on this motion might look like. But if it is about, if it is a motion about politics, for example, whether far-right parties are going to be prominent in the next 10 years, if opening government runs a case that the far-right is not going to be prominent because they are just incompetent. Trump has done very poor signaling. Le Pen, for example, is banned from running for a next election in France. And thus, this accumulation of their failure is just going to lead to them being less popular in the next 10 years. This is one argument that is, proving the motion. But then on closing government, a completely new argument would be that it is not necessarily the failure of the far right. It is the success of the center-right or center-left parties that we have seen throughout currently, for example, in Europe, with the CDU in Germany, with Merz, where they are focusing on growing the economy, and the projections for the German economy are going to be quite good in the next couple of years. So it's not the failure of the far right, it's just that in the next couple of years, center-right parties that are in power in most of Europe. We have the UK, which is center-left, but still probably center-right if you're looking at their policies. They're just going to be very popular in the next 10 years to come, just of structural reasons, that the European economy is at a stage where it actually can grow. The US tariffs, weirdly enough, have allowed it to have new markets that they can exploit, meaning that the average standard of the people within the EU is going to increase. And thus, people are just going to be happy with the parties that are currently in power, which are not the far right in most countries, maybe in Italy. But again, if you're looking at Meloni's policies, they can hardly be classified as far right, everything outside of immigration. So that looks like a, yes, sorry. That looks like a new argument, what it looks like. So that is a horizontal extension. You're just not bothering what your opening is saying. You're just running something completely new. Now, there are two other types of extensions, which, by the way, in the World's Manual are coded as extensions that should be credited and should be weighed the same amount as analysis, not analysis, but argumentative extensions. That is rebuttal extensions. When you're taking, for example, if you're CG, the argument of opening opposition, and you're just going through every single line that they have given and rebutting it for 14 minutes straight, throw out member and then in whip. This can be credited. The problem with this is that it rarely will take you the first in the debate because you're not making a contribution on your own in terms of a positive impact, a positive just in the motion in general. That said, the World's Manual is not exactly worded like this, so it is possible to win with a rebuttal extension, even though you're not bringing a benefit. The way to kind of go about it is to explain not only why the rebuttal proves that the arguments that, for example, are coming of opening opposition are not true, but it actively proves as to why they're harmful. And then you're kind of also making an argument. It's not in the structure of an argument is just throughout the rebuttal, you're not only rebutting the reasons, but you're also kind of flipping them and explaining as to why this rebuttal is leading to proving immense harm that is going to be reached on opening opposition. And then it's a little bit easier for the judge to conceptualize why exactly you can win with a rebuttal extension. But I don't think this is necessarily it can win. It's just very judges would be very risk averse to giving a rebuttal extension a win. But I have seen in very many instances rebuttal extensions getting a second. And I do think that they can get a first. It's just you need to be very particular about it and be very persuasive to the judges to why this is something that they should credit and they should put over. For example, opening government that already brings an argument. You should flesh out as to why the rebuttal contribution is something that changes this debate significantly, as to why it explains, for example, why opening government's case can win over opening opposition. And this especially, by the way, should happen in terms of rebuttal extension when your opening team has lost to the other opening team. It is very rare that your opening team is winning to the other opening team very clearly, and then you can win with a rebuttal extension, because then the contribution in the debate is not as significant. You're not explaining why one side of the debate should be heavily more weight than the other, because it's already heavily more weight than the other, because opening government already explained as to why they're winning over opening opposition. And so the instances in which you should integrate rebuttal extension will be the instances in which you're convinced that your diagonal, so your cross, is actually the team that's winning the debate. Here I just want to put an asterisk. Rebuttal extensions are especially great when they come in combination with another type of extension, especially if it's like a new argument. So half of the member's speech, for example, can be directly engagement with opening opposition, especially if opening opposition were incredibly strong, and then bringing in a new argument and kind of explaining how those two things work together. This can be an incredibly strong argument because it both engages with what already has happened with the top half and kind of clears out as to why the government bench as a whole should take over the opposition bench, but it also brings in a new impact that can be later weighed as an independent output. So that is on rebuttal extensions. Then lastly, on weighing extensions. So you can take at face value the arguments that have been made in the debate and try to explain as to why one argument is more important than the other. Not necessarily for you on your own to make arguments, but to weigh between arguments that have been already made. The logic of weighing extensions is largely similar to rebuttal extensions. You make them in situation in which the top half is very unclear, or your opening team is losing very significantly to the other opening team. For the second situation in which your opening team is losing significantly to the other opening team, it's hard to make a weighing extension because there might be just analytical problems with the case of opening government. And then however much creative and smart weighings you can think of, they're probably not going to be sufficient because the argument is not bought by the judge's face value, and thus the weighing is not going to be credited. So weighing extensions are most beneficial in situations in which the top half is very unclear, there is a deadlock. This especially happens on motions that are very heavy on characterization, where it is based on whether certain types of people are good people or on average or bad people, whether certain types of decisions on average are good or bad. That is really based on characterization. A lot of competing analysis will probably happen in the top half. The deputies are not going to be able to resolve all of these competing analysis, and thus a weighing extension here is very helpful, just explaining how those pieces of analysis interact within each other and as to why one is more important than the other. This, by the World's Manual, should be weighed as its own independent contribution, meaning that this should be able to win the debate in and of itself. But again, as with the rebuttal extension, better safe than sorry. You can give a weighing extension, but you can also then provide kind of a new argument to back it up. And the thing is, when you're making weighing extensions, very often the explanation of your weighing, the metric of your weighing, is going to have a substantive part to it as well. Like if you're inserting a weighing, and if it's like going to take 7 minutes of your speech, there is probably analytical steps of this weighing that you need to explain, certain types of characterizations that are going to make you convince the judge that one thing is more important than the other. And if you view it like this, then it's not really a weighing extension. It also brings new argument or a new perspective to the debate that is not necessarily weighing but is substantive, meaning that you can also try to explain it in this way to the judge that it's not a weighing extension, because then they might be a little bit more susceptible to buying it as an extension. But yeah, those are largely, I think, kind of the large separations that we have within extensions. But again, extensions can be largely an argument, like any other argument that comes from opening. In certain instances, they might utilize something a little bit differently. For example, they might be focusing only on one burden because you're making an analysis extension. They might be overly focusing on rebuttal or weighing. But again, the basics that you would do in opening, you would do in extension, just structured a little bit differently. Now, going on for goals for prep, because any good extension comes from prep, it's not from anything else. And how you kind of then go about the debate, how you construct the extension during the debate, how you track the teams in the debate is heavily based on what you have done with your partner in prep. So I'm just going to go through what I do with my partner in prep, and then I'm going to kind of bring a systematic structure to it and explain as to why it's something significantly valuable. So we take a longer time for silent prep. And I think this is like a practice that probably most of you do, is as opposed to 1 minute and a half for thinking of arguments as we do on opening, we take around 5 minutes independently thinking of arguments. And it's not only thinking of arguments, it's also thinking of the clashes of the debate, kind of trying to figure out what opening is going to take, what is the most intuitive line of reasoning. So we are kind of full of ideas of how the debate might look like, and then full of other ideas of possible arguments that we can run. So the first goal you should have in any prep, or at least in that 5 minutes silent part of prep, should be to come up with 5 independent ideas. Now, what do I mean by independent ideas? This kind of meshes with goal number 2. But the impacts of those arguments should be severely different, or should be not connected, or you should have a logical justification as to why they're different. That is reasonable, because if there are 2 impacts that can be the same impact, or there is no very big logical justification as to why they're separated into 2 different things, then opening government might run them as one, and then 2 of your ideas get burned instantly with 1 argument. This is not the situation that you want to be in. You want each of those impacts to be independent. So opening government cannot burn with 1 argument 2 of the independent ideas that you have come up with. That said, coming up with 5 independent ideas is quite hard. Very many motions might really not have it, or the 3rd or 4th argument or even 5th argument is just going to be a stupid one. It's not going to be something debate winning, but it kind of gets your brain moving. You start understanding what the debate is about, because if you come up with a bad idea for an argument and you know it's a bad idea, then you also know what the debate is not about, which is something valuable. I am going to go and explain how exactly to come up with 5 independent ideas in just a second. It's on the next slide. But I just wanted to kind of outline what are the other goals in prep to go through them. And the second goal is slightly related to the first goal, which is identifying what exactly are the independence of those 5 ideas that you have. It's not only the impacts that need to be different, it's also the way in which you reach those impacts to be different. Because there are certain types of motions, for example, those that are, again, based on characterization, that they are going to have very many impacts that are based on the same line of logic. So with one line of logic, you can have both arguments about outcomes about certain types of people, and then arguments, outcomes about other types of people. Now, this was very general. It was not very explicit. I'm going to give an example in just a second. But my point is, it's going to be based on the same line of argumentation. That's why it's also like a second goal. It's not only the outcomes that you want to identify in prep, like the 5 impacts that might be independent from each other that you might run as arguments, because any argument, right, is based on the impact. You are trying to prove an impact. The first thing about an argument you should identify is not a mechanism, but should be the concrete impact that you want to reach. And then you kind of need to take a step back in the goal number 2, which is try to identify, for all of those 5 reasons, what is the key mechanism of change? Why exactly something changes in the motion so that you reach this impact, and make sure that those key mechanisms of change for those 5 independent ideas are different than one another. Goal number 3 is make a prioritization list. What is kind of in your intuition the most important thing within the debate? What is the least important thing within the debate? And when you're making this prioritization list, do not take into account what opening government is going to say. What opening government is going to say very often is the thing that is first on your list. That is okay. In some instances, they might not, and it's good for you to know that this is the most intuitive, most important idea, and then you have a very low-hanging fruit coming from extension, in which you just run what opening government didn't run, and then it's very easy to win a debate in that way, because again, it's the most fundamental thing about the motion that they missed. So making a prioritization list, knowing kind of what you would run in a situation that opening government didn't run it, ranking it from 1 to 5. And then, so how to prioritize actually between those 1 to 5 ideas is to try to identify the clashes in the debate, identify what is very significant about the debate, and then kind of figure it out from there. How to do that, I'll talk about in a second. Again, this is kind of outlining everything that there is to do in an extension, and then I'm going to dive into each one of those topics, how to content generate, how to identify the key mechanism of change, the key burden of change, and then kind of how to then interact with the clashes of the debate. And then the fourth goal that you have is make an outline for each argument. So make the logical flow of the argument. What would be the burdens for each argument? Burdens of arguments, I'm going to talk about them in like 2 slides, are largely the same. You need to identify a problem in the status quo. You need to identify then how this motion solves the problem, both in terms of ability under the motion and in terms of incentive under the motion. And then you need to explain as to why this is significantly different than any other alternative of the motion. So why it wouldn't happen for symmetrical reasons, this type of change that you're talking about. And then you probably have the impacts. It varies sometimes. It's not always the same thing. Sometimes burdens occur just by the nature of the motion. There will be a burden that is just characterization of a certain actor of the motion, and that would be an independent burden. But this is something that you kind of work out as you go along and do a lot of arguments, because it's just kind of intuition based. That said, always the burden of change, which is proving as to why something happens on your side of the house and doesn't happen on their side of the house, and how big this difference between one side of the house and the other is, so the delta. This is always the most important part of an argument. Other things such as characterization of the status quo, characterization of a certain actor comes secondary to this. And so it's important that you identify which is this key burden for each of those arguments and kind of figure out what you want to say for them. So this actually falls what you want to say under those in goal number 2, because that's the key mechanism of change. There, in this burden, the key mechanism of change is going to fit in. And then kind of that's it for what you need to do in prep. In terms of looking at the argumentative part, it should broadly cover everything that there is to say about the debate, and there should be parallel to this a discussion of what the debate is about. But again, ideally, this would happen when you're making the prioritization list, because you would chat through the clashes of the debate, and so you have an overview of how the debate looks like. Now, going in a little bit more to every single one of those things. The first one is content generation, how to actually come up with 5 independent reasons for each argument. So this is something that I have talked about a lot. Those are like 3 concepts that I have that I had thought of. They're not something new. It's just a thing that I get my brain to think about of how I generate content. So because I have debated for quite a while, for me, it's just kind of ideas come to me. They strike me from the sky. There is no logic or method to it, but it's probably based on just my practice. In order for you to get to that stage where you just kind of think of the things in an unsystematic way and they still work, you need to make it a habit for yourself. How to make it a habit is to try to figure out what is the system behind the habit and work it out from there. I think there are 3 separate systems that you can think about. The first one is actor-oriented method. So you're taking the motion and you're trying to identify all of the different actors that can be affected by the motion. So if we're talking about the minimum wage, we probably have people that are currently working within those companies. What is going to happen with them? Are they going to receive less money, although they have a contract with the company, they have worked for the company for 10 years? We have unemployed people that currently do not have a job. Are they going to be employed under the motion? We also have companies. Are they going to turn a profit? What does this mean for the general economy? Then you have the average Joe that only purchases products from those companies. Is his experience going to change? Are the types of products that he's interacting with going to change? Is the price of those products going to change under this motion? This is also something to think about. And then the average Joe, you can also break up within different groups of people. You can have rich people, you can have poor people, and kind of try to explain as to why it affects them in a different way. You probably also have the government. How is this government implementing this policy? Is there an external impact on the government based on this policy? Does this allow for companies to lobby the government in a better way? Does it allow for the government to have stricter oversight of companies or weaker oversight of companies? Probably if you're on opposition, you want to claim that the government has a weaker oversight. But that's my point. If you kind of think about all of the things that are possible in terms of actor under these motions, and then you try to think about, just ask yourself questions. How might they be affected under the motion? The arguments are just going to start flowing in, because if you force yourself to think of change for every single one of those groups, you're probably going to think of a change for every single one of those groups. So that's the actor-oriented method. Then we have the method-oriented method. I know method said like 100 times at this point. But what does this mean? And I just want to put an asterisk here. Very often this can be very helpful in motions that are very procedural, that are about a policy and its implementation, that are about a change in how the government works, that are about implementation of something new, of a business model of companies that they should be operating in one way than another. So we are talking about very procedural motions that are often their delta is not clear from the motion itself. It might be specified, but you still don't know what exactly the difference is between one world and the other under this change. And then you're trying to think, okay, what did the change actually looks like? And the method-oriented method of thinking about those motions is to try to work out what are all of the steps through which this policy kind of needs to go through before its actual implementation. And then after it's implemented, all of those steps on how it's implemented and then how it reaches people. So an example I would give here is if we have the motion about negative voting. So I don't know the info site perfectly, but you can either vote for a party or you can remove a vote from a party, and they're mutually exclusive. So you can vote negatively for a party and it takes away one of their votes. So this motion, again, if you think about it just without any context and not systematically, the delta is not clear because you have some votes that are coming in, you have some votes that are going out. You probably have a lot of those parties, so it's not necessarily clear who is going to vote negatively for which party. Is this actually going to have an impact for the established parties? Is it going to have an impact for the not established parties? How does this affect the far right? All of those things. It's unclear. It's not something that you can intuitively say, oh, this works in this particular way. And that's why you need to interrogate the way in which it works. You need to kind of go through all of those different little nooks and crannies of the motion and kind of try to figure it out here. Now, so how would this look like? The first thing is the government implementing this policy. And then here you have a question. Would the government implement this policy in a good way? Would it explain it in a way that's understandable to the population? Would the population actually opt in for using the negative vote because it's based on whether the government has explained it to them? Because if a system that's very hard and it's not straightforward, then people might not opt into it. Here an illustration that I want to give is with the Bulgarian voting system. So you have the basic parliamentary proportional system where we vote for parties and then they take a chunk of parliament based on the percentages that they get. But we also have a majoritarian aspect of the system, which is when I go to vote for my party, I can see the different types of politicians in my party, and I can, after I have voted for my party, vote for one of those politicians to get in parliament as opposed to another. I don't vote negatively for any politician. It's just when I vote for one, I'm giving my preference to them. And then based on those preferences, the party is making its lineup within parliament when they have actually won the seats. Those preferences that people vote are actually what determines which are the individual politicians that are getting in parliament. Now, the percentage of the Bulgarian population that understands this second part of our voting system, which is not about voting just for a party, but voting for the individual politicians from this party to get in parliament, is laughably small. Because the government never actually bothered when they implemented this policy to explain it in a very particular way to the population, in a way that's understandable. Most of the population doesn't understand that the politicians that are getting in parliament are based on constituencies, and the people are not voting for a party, but they're voting for those politicians from the constituency, and that's why you can choose from one or the other person from the constituency that you're voting for. Now, this is a fault of the government, and that's why I'm giving you an example of this. You always need to think, especially in motions that are about policies, how is the government going to implement it? Or more importantly, how is the government going to fuck this up? And if you're on the side that is opposing, you exploit this, you make it as an argument. If you're on the side that proposes the policy, you should always have in your model or in your characterization as to why the government will not do this in a bad way. There is always this one clash whether the government is going to do it in a good or a bad way. Now that we have established that the government kind of does it, you need to not only interrogate, okay, how does this work for every single individual party that we have under the system, you also need to interrogate the larger process of then elections. Let's break up the process of elections. Okay, we have the day of election, which is probably where then you need to, you kind of want to figure out, okay, which are the type of parties that people are going to use their negative votes on. Is it a zero-sum game? Is it targeted towards specific parties? But there is this other part of the election that is actually quite much more important to how people are then actually going to use their votes, which is the election campaign. This motion probably changes the election campaign to a very big extent, right? Because now parties do not have only a benefit to campaign about themselves, to say, we are a great party, you should vote for us, but they can also strategically campaign against a party, and parties can join in campaigning against one party so that they increase the negative voting for this one party. Is there going to be a consensus of for example, establishment parties that they're not only campaigning individually amongst themselves about themselves, but they're also joining to hate on the far right, so the far right receives a lot of negative votes? Or is it the case that they're going to, one party is going to, one establishment party is going to campaign negatively about the other establishment party and vice versa? Because in that situation, what will happen in the second situation? There will be a zero sum on the types of negative votes the two parties of the establishment that might be close in votes have. But what it would do is inflate the votes that smaller parties have, because they haven't received a lot of negative vote and their core constituencies have voted for them. And so this will inflate their positions within parliament. But if it's the other way around, where parties join together and hate on one individual party, then they're not necessarily losing votes because this individual party isn't gaining votes. And so even though they have won less, so they have won, as opposed to 30-30%, they have won 20-20, but this one party has won zero or virtually zero, which means that when we get to the shuffling of the parliament, so giving seats in parliament, them winning 20% doesn't actually mean anything because their percentage is going to get inflated. Just how the parliamentary system works. I know this was a little bit vague and the percentages did not make a lot of sense, but if a lot of parties have, for example, 3% of the vote, and those are like 30% of the vote, like 10 parties, each of them has a 3%. And you have a barrier in parliament, which is a party under 4% cannot enter parliament. Those 30% of the votes, although they're a very big chunk percentage of the votes, they don't get to parliament, so they get reshuffled between the parties that have already entered parliament. And that's why a party can win 20% of the votes, but then gets inflated to 30% of the seats within parliament, just because they got certain percentages reshuffled from the parties that did not enter parliament. This was a very quick asterisk on why what I'm talking about makes logical sense. So the zero-sum idea is if, for example, a party that is very big is campaigning both for itself, but also against a very big other party. And the other party that is also very big does the same. Like they're also campaigning for themselves, but they're also campaigning against this one party. You would have both parties would have core constituents that are only voting for the parties. So if, for example, one party has 100 core constituents voting for them, and then the other is going to have another 100, there is an additional electorate that those both parties have that is then going to go vote negatively for the other party. So party A is getting 100 positive votes for them, and another 50 of their core constituents are voting negatively for party B. Party B also has 100 people voting for them, but also another 50 people voting negatively for party A. In the end of the day, both of those parties then, after the equalization of all of this, have received 20 votes because you subtract the votes. But this doesn't make it any meaningfully different than both of them having 150 votes. Because in terms of percentages, it's proportional, right? And so between those two parties, it's a zero-sum game, whether they vote positively for each other, so they convince their electorate to vote positively for them, or they convince the electorate, part of the electorate, to vote positively for them and then negatively for another part of the electorate. But what this would do is it would bring 50 votes for both of those parties, although in reality, the people that have been involved within this voting would have been, as opposed to 100, which is the sum of their votes, 300, or however, like the number that I said, maybe 200, I don't know. Other parties that have 50 people voting for them, but just not voting negatively at all, would also have 50 votes. And then other smaller parties that, in an alternative system where both of those big parties receive 150 votes, would receive 50 votes, and they would be a third of the big party. In a system where those two parties have zero sum themselves, we have 4 parties that have received 50 votes, although the other 2 smaller parties don't actually have the same constituency as the first ones. Is just that nobody voted negatively against them. That was the point of this zero-sum argument. That said, I gave you a very complex motion. I think the negative voting system, the more you think about it, the more complex the debate gets. But that's the point. It's a complex thing, and you need to interrogate each part of the process so you can reach this outcome. And then based on how the process looks like, you can draw different impacts from it. And that's why it's so important that you understand the process. And in those types of motions, this is just the way to think about arguments. And if you break it up then in, okay, how does the government implement this? How does the election campaign looks like? How do people vote? And then you can also have an argument about how parties then interact with each other within parliament. Whether they're going to hate on each other more within parliament because they're preparing for the next election campaign, whether they're going to be nicer to each other, what types of coalitions are going to get formed. This is another outcome of the motion that might be up to change, that you can possibly think of an argument in, right? Yeah, so that was on the motion-oriented thing. Clash-oriented. So you're thinking about the clashes of the debate, and then you're just trying to extract arguments based on those clashes. So if we have a motion about the environment, whether we should prioritize making a lot of carbon emission tax as at the cost of, decreasing the use of coal and just increasing the price of fuel just in general, and then of energy. This is the fundamental trade-off, right? Whether we are going to benefit the environment or we are going to have cheap and accessible goods. Then the clashes are, on which side of the house are we going to have more accessible goods? On which side of the house are we going to affect the environment in a more positive way? And then you can try to draw arguments based on those clashes. And although from the side that is against carbon emissions, it seems much more intuitive that you can, that is for carbon emissions tax, it seems much more intuitive that you can make an argument as to why, the environment is much better off. That does not necessarily mean that on the other side of the house, you cannot possibly think of an argument that stands up for the environment actually on our side of the house is much better. It's going to be much more an intuitive argument, but doesn't mean that you can't make an argument there. Meaning that if you identify the clashes of the debate, you can also try to identify gaps, like logical gaps of the debate that you would want to try to fill. This is the first thing that I'm going to send you, which is I have a much larger presentation of this content generation, which also have examples, and then it has when to use what. This specific presentation has been uploaded Sorry, I am just did not do the permissions correctly. So there you have it. It has been uploaded in like an Audible workshop that you can look at. I think it was St. Andrew's Debate Academy last year, so you can find my talking head talking about this much more in depth there. But it's kind of this. So that's how you go in the direction of trying to generate 5 ideas in prep. This always should be the aim, that you have 5 ideas out of prep. If you have 4, that's fine. This is more than enough. It's just you should have the mentality. You kind of need to hustle yourself to the point where you have 5 ideas. It might not be always, but you always need to have this mentality. Yeah. Thinking about then motions. There tends to be a fundamental question behind each motion, and your job in back half is to try to clearly identify it. What do I mean by this? When CAs set motions, it is not necessarily something happens within society and I want there to be an argument about this. No, it's much more practical, and there is a comparative that we are thinking about. There is a fundamental trade-off that we are trying to identify, and we're like, okay, what is more important, to have this or to have this? And then we dress it up in wording. We make it sound nicer. Maybe we hide the comparative a little bit more so it's not as intuitive to speakers, so back up, can have something to do. But yes, a very obvious fundamental question that I can show you what it is on the motion, this house would grant national central banks veto power over legislation which significantly increases national debt. So in this motion, obviously the motion is about whether this is a fundamentally decision that should be taken by experts or it is a fundamentally political decision. So all of the analysis within this motion is going to be based on the characterization of how politicians look like, what are their incentives, when are they going to take out those loans, and what are experts, what are their incentives. Are they going to be very fiscally responsible and are going to try to tighten the economy so they're never going to give the government the ability to draw more national debt? Or are they going to intervene only in very specific circumstances when it really makes sense and politicians are really populistic? But then on the side of politicians, it would be politicians have good incentives, and even in instances in which the economic benefits are not entirely clear about why exactly economically this makes sense. Something like national debt might have value that is outside of economy. For example, this does not happen, but just for the sake of it, indulge me. If they take national debt to invest within education, this is not very often visible how it affects the economy, especially if you're investing in building schools about people that are just entering school. So we are talking about people from the age of 7 till the age of 13. We are going to bear and reap the benefits of them being more educated 20, 30 years down the line. It's very hard to calculate what the economic benefit of this is, but it might be just a valuable thing that is not going to improve the economy in the country in 30 years, but it's just good to have educated people because they can enjoy life more, they can conceptualize life more, they can interact with people better, right? There are things that are not necessarily based on expertise, especially economic expertise, that might be beneficial based on this national debt, but it's something that central banks do not understand. It is not within their qualifications to understand, and thus that's why there are instances in which they will veto, but actually it was a good idea to take to draw this national debt. Again, it's not a situation in which countries draw national debt to build schools, or at least it's not as explicit. It might be a general direction, and then this is one of the infrastructure programs that they have, and that's why this is not a great example. But it was just to illustrate that there are certain things that are intangible to the experts in the central bank that might not, that might be very good. And so what the fundamental trade-off of this motion is it a political decision which might bear more risks, just in terms of it might not make more sense about the economy, it might lead to inflation, but it might reap very diverse benefits, not only about the economy. So is it a political decision with more risk, but possibly higher reward? Or is it an expert decision with less risk, but also less reward? So the fundamental question behind this motion is risk versus reward. This is like the fundamental trade-off from which the CA started, and then he dressed the motion to look like this. I know this is a little bit hard, but I'm going to just say a couple of themes that are very prominent in terms of the fundamental questions. They're very often either centered around risk and reward, or very often quality versus quantity. And this is what the second motion is about. It has an info slide. I just didn't want to put it on the slide because it's gigantic. Give me a second. Here is the info slide. So this is round one of Panama. Maybe some of you have debated it. Classic education relies on teacher-led structure lectures with minimal student-driven discussion and exercises. Subjects are distinct units that are clearly delineated, e.g. math, English, and are taught primarily through textbooks. In contrast, progressive education positions teenagers as facilitators with a focus on teachers as facilitators, with a focus on student-led discussion, project-based learning, and experimental learning. Learning is organized thematically around a single topic and can draw on sources such as news articles, fiction books, documentaries, academic papers in different areas. For the purposes of this debate, secondary schools refers to school students from the age of 14 to 18. And then the motion is, sorry, no, wrong slides. The motion is this house prefers secondary education adopting a classical education model rather than a progressive education model. Now, this motion is a little bit harder to identify what exactly the core question of the debate is. What was the fundamental trade-off from which the CA started that then got addressed within this motion? But if you start making an argument, and this is where the benefit of back half is, if the motion is this, top half might not intuitively know what the trade-off of the debate is, and thus might not intuitively know what they need to do in order to win the debate. So how I would go about this is to say that the classic educational model probably leads to a lower barrier to studying. It's easier to understand things if they're given very clearly to you, if they're in a teacher-based environment and they're just spoon-feeding you analysis, right? This is something that is probably with a very low barrier to entry because you don't, as a student, need to do something significant. But at the same time, the trade-off here is that it's probably not very effective for like actually making people thinking people. So it is low barrier to entry. So they're going to learn some stuff, but they're not going to learn bigger, more important stuff just because they're not actually making students engage. They're not teaching them important life skills such as research. On the other side of the house, which is about progressive educational model, it is a much higher entry barrier, right? Students need to be engaged, to actually care, to sit down, do homework, research, try to like literally bang their heads against the table, thinking of ideas of what the research paper is about. Like you have read the research papers. They're so fucking complex. It's very hard to understand them, right? And so if we are giving this to students, they might not get the core idea. They might be very demotivated. It's hard. That's the point of the progressive model, that it is hard and thus it will reap bigger and better benefits for the students that opt into it. But that's the thing. Not as much students as on the other side of the house would opt into this model because just not as much of them would meet this very high barrier of entry, which is actually engaging with this, thinking constantly about this, all of this. And so what the motion then becomes is whether education should be accessible but worse or inaccessible but better. And so if we can rephrase it, the motion becomes quantity over quality. Because in one case, you have a lot of quantity of people that are engaging with education, but the quality of this education might be shit. On the other side, you have less quantity of students that are engaging with this, but the quality of education of the ones that are going to actually engage with it is great. Now, why is this a very important thing to understand, especially on back half? And this is something that you can train with all types of motions. But again, you really need to interrogate what the motion is about and kind of try to reach this fundamental trade-off. It's very helpful because if you understand the trade-off, you understand what is the type of argument that you want to bring in order to win the trade-off. And more specifically, then explain to the judge as to why this argument wins the trade-off. If you can stand up and say, what I did just now to a judge. Say, this motion is about access over quality. Explain your logic there. And then give an argument as to why access is more important than quality. You have won. Like, there will be little to no discussion whether you're winning this debate because you have understood the motion and whatever argument opening government has made, it might be related to this clash, but they did not understand what the purpose of this argument is within the debate. You want to understand the purpose of what you're saying. And back half is great for that because you have so much time to interrogate the motion, to listen to the top half. That is why I said listening and tracking is very important, because they're going to accidentally, in very many instances, argue those key clashes and point you about what this motion is about, but they're not going to go full way. They're not going to go all of the way to understanding what they're exactly doing. They're going just by the intuitions of the motion, because the motion is pointing you in a direction, but they don't necessarily understand what the fundamental trade-off is. And then you, especially on this motion on back half, can stand up and explain it to the judge, give maybe weighing, maybe new contextualization. You don't need to bring an entirely new argument and win. Now, I wanted to, we are going to come back to this in a second. I wanted to give another thing that you can do, which is, again, what do we do then after we have all of this information about when we have identified the trade-off of the motion, and then we kind of bring this. You can bring new material that explicitly engages and answers the question. You can broaden the scope. You can make it more specific. You can weigh it out. You can do all of this from closing, but again, with a very certain direction. Or secondly, and this is very important, you can flip the fundamental trade-off. You can try to, I call it flip the pancake. I know in English it's flip burgers, but in Bulgarian it's flip the pancake. While this motion about education, on the side that is about the progressive model, it is intuitive that it is less accessible for many children. If I am CEO, for example, what I would try to explain is actually the unintuitive part. I would explain as to why this is majorly accessible and comparatively more accessible than the classical model. I would say a lot of children don't have the attention span, especially right now. They cannot listen to classical education. A lot of them on the side are doing a lot of this progressive research that the motion is talking about. They are watching documentaries, they are reading fiction, and for them it's going to be much more easy to opt into a progressive model of learning that is actually feeding them what they already know and just kind of refining the processes. So it is actually comparatively much more accessible when they're for a lot of children to opt into education within the progressive model. With the classical education, they get bored, they hate their teachers, the textbooks and one are the same. They're written in a language that children do not understand, and thus it's incredibly inaccessible, and people very often opt out of it. And what I have now done is I have flipped the fundamental question. Although this is the fundamental question of the debate, it doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot interact with it, you cannot break it, and you cannot try to prove the unintuitive part. And this is where I'll get to this graphic that is just here. Some types of motions, I like to call them asymmetric motions, have a clash that is won by either side intuitively just by the virtue of the motion. And that's kind of related to the fundamental question. So on the motion of education, the clash on quality of education is probably won by opposition, but the clash on quantity of education, the accessibility of education, is probably won by proposition and lost by opposition. The way in which you win those types of motions is you weigh between clashes, you explain as to why one clash is more important than the other. But that does not necessarily mean that you cannot try to make an argument on opposition about quantity and win with it. And that's the beauty of back half. You have so much time to think of reasons. This is something that opening government or opening opposition, in this case of my example, would not go for because it's unintuitive. This is a clash that they intuitively lose, and so they will go for the argument that they intuitively win. But if you try to win on the clash that proposition is winning, if you try to win the OG clash, then it's an additional benefit and something that the judge might value very highly, because you can also co-opt the weighing that government has given towards opposition as to why quantity of education, accessibility of education is something more important. And then it's much easier for you to weigh over your opening. You can use that some ideas are not intuitive, and you can make them in arguments, and you can, spend a lot of time proving them just because you have so much more time than opening, which is going to make them sound very convincing, although they're unintuitive ideas. Very quickly, because I have overstanded my stay, sorry, I like yapping sometimes. There are other types of motions, which I like to call symmetric motions. Now, all of this is not real terminology. It's just how I think about debating and like ideas that I have come up with. They're not necessarily called like that in real life. In debating, if you say that to a judge, they would not understand what you mean. But there are certain motions which there is not an obvious winner to the clashes that they are. So those are the symmetric types of motions. The very obvious example of this is motions that are about, how is it called? Social movements. You always have a clash on money. You always have a clash on followers. You always have a clash on corporate support. You always have a clash on whether you're going to pass more policy. Neither of those clashes is won by one side or the other intuitively. Those are types of motions that are based on characterization. And all of other types of motions are very often symmetric motions where you just need to be much more analytical. So you're not weighing impacts. The impacts that you're claiming are the same. You're arguing the same clashes. You both want more money for the movement. You both want more support for the movement. It's just how you get to this more money, how you get to this more support. So it is based on the process and characterization of how the process looks like. In those types of motions, it's the way to win from back half is not necessarily try to flip the logic, try to run something unintuitive. But again, here is why weighing extension is very helpful and rebuttal extension. The top half is going to be incredibly messy. There is going to be so much competing analysis coming from one side and the other just based on how those things work, because characterization just works in this way. Top deputies do not have as much time to try to think of so many responses towards the other characterization that is coming. And then you can just make it very clear to the judge as to why your side of the bench is winning over the other, because you just have so much time to actually engage with all of the material and explain to the judge how the material engages with itself. Because the judge also in those types of situations, they're confused people. Like if you have 15 points of characterization coming from the top half, and you as a judge need to go through those 15 points and evaluate which point is more important than the other, which point is logically prior. The judge wants to not kill themselves. This is not the right thing, but this is a very hard deliberation to go through. And so if you from closing are able to bring back those 15 points, explain how those 15 points interact with each other, rebut those points that you don't like, then the judge is going to just want to give you the win just because you have made their job within deliberation, within OA, so much easier. So you need to kind of help out the judge in those types of motions. So rebuttal here and weighing, very helpful. Last bit, again, returning to what do we do in terms of extensions. So you can bring new material that explicitly answers the questions that we talked about. You can flip the question that we talked about, or you can also try to escape the question. If we take the motion, this house believes that Green Party should practice green centrism as opposed to green progressivism. This is not a BMP motion. I'm very sorry. This is a WSDC motion, but I think it's a fine motion, and so we can discuss it. Where for the purposes of this debate, green parties can take one of two approaches: green centrism versus green progressivism. Green centrism involves focusing on environmental issues and being willing to work with right-wing parties. Green progressivism, in contrast, involves also focusing on social justice issues and refusing to work with right-wing parties. Now, the fundamental question that I think, in my opinion, comes out of this debate is, can you be successful without working with the right wing? Now, if you interrogate it a little bit more, it's probably also going to be quality over quantity, because if you work with the right wing, then you're going to make some compromises on the types of policies that you're going to do. And so you're going to compromise on quality, but you might get much more quantity because, just again, a lot of right-wing parties are in power right now. Probably a good bet to side with them just if you want to get policy passed, but the policy is going to be much more washed out. On the other side of the house, if you're left-wing, probably you're going to get less policy passed for the reasons that I just said, but the types of policies that you're going to get passed are just going to be great. They're not going to be washed out. They're going to make major change. And again, it's quality over quantity. But the underlying question of this is siding with the right wing. This is like the debate, right? Siding with the right wing, good or bad. How do you escape this question? Which is kind of interrogating your own intuition, interrogating also the intuition of the CA that said this motion. Are climate change policies, like preventing climate change policy, green policies, actually inherently left-wing? Can't you convince the right that it is in the interest of the right to do green policy? Because if you think about it, it is not a left-wing thing to try to save the earth and save the population of the earth from climate change, global warming, the global weirding when you have floods in Texas, a red state, when you have typhoons and hurricanes all over the world. overflowing of rivers that are killing people. This is probably a bipartisan issue. Both the left wing and the right wing can work together to actually want across the aisles to implement green policies. And I know that right wing parties tend to opt for, free economy, not being very conservative, not being conservative with the economy, trying to set as little boundaries on it, so they are not going to be so willing for carbon taxation. But it's not inherently true that they're going to oppose it if they think it's that big of an issue. And so if you're interrogating this from closing, what you can stand up and say is, no, 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 no. We are not compromising on quality of policy, because actually the type of policy is bipartisan. And then spend a couple of minutes as to why green parties, firstly, be specific about the type of policy. Secondly, explain as to why green parties can convince the right wing as to why the global warming is something incredibly important, and as to why the right wing is going to get persuaded by this. And then you have escaped the question because you have interrogated both your intuition but also the intuition of the CA. Is it actually that green parties are inherently left-wing? Probably not. If that's not the case, you can kind of escape it. And you're viewing the debate from like a step back, a macro level, a very judge way of viewing the debate, which is always a good thing because then the intuition of the judge will stay with yours. Now, last bit, and then you have a random graphic because that was the Canva template that I chose. If you can, like, all of this needs to cooperate with you tracking your opening very closely, knowing exactly what they're running, being very explicit to the judge about what is your extension, how it interacts with opening, and using the wording of the opening about what exactly they have run. You need to always make sure that the judge understands the difference between your argument and the argument of opening, or how your argument solves the problem of the top half as a whole. Even though it's a new argument, it might not be even on the same clash. It might still solve a problem, a deadlock that exists in top half, explaining that to the judge very clearly. Here, in extension specifically, you want to break the fourth wall. You want to talk specifically and explicitly to the judge, to walk the judge through your thought process so they understand all of the justification that you had for all of the decisions that you have made. And then explain what the motion is about. Use your understanding of the fundamental question in debating and explain it back to the judge. Show the judge that you are very knowledgeable about the motion, and not necessarily knowledgeable about the motion, but how the debate operates. This is always something that is going to be beneficial for you. And then lastly, but this is like with any other argument, I just need to mention it, you need to be technical. You need to be able to prove your case, just in terms of you need to be able to meet all of its analytical burdens, because however good your case is positioned, however like good of an answer it provides to the fundamental question of the debate, if it's not well constructed, it's not going to matter. That said, I never go to the time to actually walk you through how do we build arguments, how do we do burdens. But again, I just can't go through all of the different things that there are about debating, because I hope you understand that this is a lot about fundamentally how you debate more than it is about extension. It just fits with the extension part. Here is a document that I had written a couple of years back. I don't defend all of the things that are said within this document. Again, a couple of years back, I scanned through it. There might be some grammatical mistakes. But yeah, you can just kind of go through it. There is explanation of what are the basic building blocks of arguments, what are the differences between those building blocks, because, for example, what is the difference between mechanism and analysis? This is something that debaters very often get wrong. And then kind of formula for creating the argument. What are the two different parts of the argument? You have the problem and the solution. How do they can be broken down further? And then how do you basically construct impact? This is just like a template that you can use, very easy for just doing training. And then it's not a perfect template as anything in debating. Debating is always evolving. Again, my understanding of extensions is always evolving. And so the more you do it, the more you're going to understand how imperfect this template is. Like, for example, I don't construct arguments at all like this, but it's like the way I construct arguments, again, is very much based on intuition at this point. And so you want to be able to develop this intuition. So just the more you practice, the better it will get. But yeah, you can go through it. And then, yeah, sorry for taking much longer than I was supposed to. Thank you for listening to me. I know I talk a lot very often. Maybe I should have been, again, a little bit more interactive with you. It's just a little bit of a time constraint, so I don't, I know that also it's late for you. So if you have any questions, I'm here. If not, you can reach out to me. You can also, like, if you want, reach out to Himan, although that might be a little bit too much work for him. And then he can reach out to me and I can provide like written answers to everything that you guys want to talk to me about. Because sometimes messages get in requests and my requests are full of bots and I don't look at them. And so if we're not friends on Facebook, I might not respond to you. That's why I'm saying, Himan. Yeah. Do you have any questions right away? Or yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, just one question. I understood what you said about zero sum, but like, could you just once tell or reiterate how to use that particularly in your argument, or basically how does that work? Like, where do we use that?
It depends on the type of argument that you want to do. For example, if I am on the side that supports negative voting, I would say it's a good idea because it will, the establishment parties will use part of their votes to go against the other establishment party. But this will also then, because of the zero sum between the establishment parties, lead to smaller parties receiving a bigger chunk of seats in parliament. This is a good thing. It makes parliament more diverse. It actually represents much better the views of the people. And then this just generally leads to the creation of good policy. So this is how I would use this argument from proposition. How I would use this argument from opposition is say the same thing happens, but actually small parties receiving more votes is something bad. Those small parties tend to be extremist, even though like we can both talk about the right wing and the left wing, we can talk about both far right and far left. This is not productive for parliament. They often do not engage with the process of parliament. They refuse to form coalitions. They are unhelpful in policy building. They're just kind of making a spectacle. They're making the rhetorics in parliament kind of be worse just in general, and they're thus harming the political process with their existence in parliament. You can also say that it's unrepresentative, right? Because it's not actually the will of the people for those parties to have that many seats within parliament, those small parties to have that many seats in parliament. It's just the zero-sum game that has happened with the bigger parties. And that's kind of how I would use this argument from prop or from op. And then again, if you want to escape this argument, then I would say parties would collaborate and actively campaign against one party or two parties that are very on the far, maybe far right in very many instances. Like in Germany, for example, if negative voting existed for this election, probably the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, which is the CDU, would have joined together to campaign against the AfD, which are the far right within Germany. And then through this campaigning, the AfD would have received much less votes. Sure, those two parties would also have received much less votes, but because they have both joined within this uh, campaign, they're not individually losing that much votes. Together, they might be losing quite a bit, but it doesn't matter because individually they still have like from 20%, they've fallen to 15, but that's still not that big of a fall if AfD is fallen from 30 to 20. Now, percentages again don't work like that, but for the purposes, I would, for example, claim this on prop. On op, I might say that this is a bad thing, right? That we shouldn't be able to exclude those types of parties. They probably have a very large constituency, given that they're receiving 30% without the negative vote. Like AfD doesn't lose its supporters just because it received a lot of negative votes, which actually leads to worse things for the democratic system. People are going to feel disillusioned with it. They're going to feel like there is this elite of people within the country that is trying to impose their political views on them. AfD might campaign against this, say, look how many negative votes that we had, look at all of those election campaigns that the CDU did against us. This is unfair, they're fascists in this way. And this is actually going to drive up their popularity in the long term. So this is, for example, the alternative characterization of how this debate plays out, how I would use it from either side. But yeah, this is kind of my conception.
All right, thank you.
I
No
had
worries.
a question. So this is something I continuously struggle with from closing. Sometimes you generate more ideas, but you don't like top half grabs the intuitive material. At bottom half, you're like, I have two or three ideas, don't really know which one to prioritize. More often than not, don't really know what the judge will buy, given that the top half clash is often really like it's solid, it's the most intuitive stuff, so it has solidified. How do you sort of enter or like cut through a lot of what the top half has said? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, no, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it's getting to the gist of it. So what I would do in those types of situations, I completely understand. They have taken like the 1 and 2 ideas that you have, and then you are left with 3, 4, and 5, which are probably not the greatest arguments that you can run. So in those situations, what you want to do is have a very good understanding of what the top half actually did, and try to explain to the judge, okay, this is what happened in the top half, this is what OG ran, this is what O ran. Some of the OG cases mitigated by O because of this and this and this. This is not a stab, you're just pointing out how the debate played out. Some of the opposition cases also mitigated by OG. So realistically, the impacts that both teams in top half are reaching are much lesser than they claim them out to be. And then you bring your argument, and it now comparatively seems more important, right? Because you have diminished the value and you have explained to the judge what has happened in the top half. And then you're bringing this one argument. Ideally, you would also make the connection between this one argument and kind of the clash that happened in the top half. While it might not be explicitly connected with the top half clash, you might try to connect it. For example, if the top half clash is happening within the West, and then you're bringing an argument from developing countries, which might not be as relevant to the debate, you then can later connect it with the top half clash and say, for the West, the functioning of developing countries is actually quite vital. And you have like a couple of reasons for that. And then say, I explained to you what the top half did and why it's mitigated. Now, we have this concrete impact, but it also interacts with the top half clash because it's connected to Western countries in this and this way. And then you kind of still have a completely new argument. It's not the greatest, but you're also pointing out that what happened in the top half, just by virtue of a debate being there, it's mitigated in terms of how much of impacts they can claim. And then you're intersecting this and trying to connect your argument with the top half clash. Ideally, in all instances, you would have some reasoning as to why your argument is connected to the top half clash, although it might not be very explicitly. You just kind of need to brainstorm. You should kind of adopt a mentality that within debating, you can make connections between all types of clashes and all types of arguments. The only limitation that you have is your mind. And if you try to think in that direction, at a certain point, you're going to come up with an explanation that half makes sense. And then if you say it with pretty enough words, it will make sense to the judge. Does that make sense?
Yep, for sure.
I just have one follow-up question on that explanation that you just gave. Um, so I think the issue that I sometimes run into when I try to do this is simply that judges will say that sure, OG might have been mitigated by O's arguments or like responses. However, when comparing OG to CG like in isolation, then these like responses don't necessarily count, and thus we have to compare like the positive material of OG in isolation with CG, and then I'm just unsure like how.
Okay, there are two things to this. This is a very fair question, by the way, because in reality, judges need to adjudicate it in the way that you said, which is independent of O's responses to OG. What is the benefit of OG? So the first and very technical way to kind of go around this is to say to the judge, it's not necessarily that all responses mitigated the case, but they pointed out problems with the case, which necessarily, just by the virtue of OG not explaining them in depth, lead to their impact being mitigated. And so in those instances, you don't necessarily rely on O's responses to take down the OG case. You're just pointing out that O's responses just might not even respond to the case so much, but point out the gaps of analysis that OG had that just mitigate their case. Now, this is probably still not going to be sufficient for a lot of judges, and I understand this. It's just a kind of a way to get around it that is clever. But the more real thing is, I understand sometimes it's very hard. There are two things to this. The first one is if you have tried to explain why the argument intersects within the top half clash, the judge necessarily needs to take into account what the top half clash look like and how they interacted with each other. If half of your speech is spent on mapping it out and then rebutting a lot of things that came out from OO, then the judge cannot just ignore what happened in the clash in and of itself and only weigh you against OG. More so what they're going to do is weigh you against both top half teams in a chunk, and then it's a little bit easier so you don't need to be weighed in isolation with either team. That's one. That's a little bit harder. No, not a little bit. That's much harder. But again, if you're able to link your case to the top half clash, this is the ideal situation in which you are. The second, which is just not ideal in very many instances, especially if your argument is weaker, just weighing. Your whip just needs to spend a lot of time taking OG at their most charitable and giving a lot of reasons as to why, even though your case might not be intuitively the most important one, it still is the most important one. And the thing with weighing is judges can dismiss some of it. If there is a lot of very rigorous weighing, they cannot just ignore it and they need to engage with it. And the thing is, the more weighing that you give, the easiest it is for a judge to justify as to why, in deliberation, in a way, to just use the justification you have said to kind of feed back and explain as to why your thing is winning over OG case. This is hard because just weighing as a concept is probably the hardest part of debating as like a basic skill. I myself probably could not be able to do that. My teammate is very good at weighing, so I'm very blessed in this sort of way because I never actually had to struggle that much with this because regardless of the extension that I run, he can pull out weighing out of his ass. That is actually persuasive. I don't know how he does it, but he does it. But again, here I'm just not being as helpful as I want to be. It's just sometimes you're stuck in situations. So I think the easiest way to go about it is to try to connect your argument to the top half clash so the judge cannot ignore the mitigation that happened there. But in other instances, just like do a lot of weighing drills, especially if you're a second speaker. Force your second speaker to do a lot of weighing drills. Aim to give like 4 pieces of weighing that are independent from each other. 3 of them are going to be shit, doesn't matter. The more you do it within a speech, the more you're actually going to improve in terms of how good they are. And so that will kind of get you to the point where weighing actually will work even for cases that are not great. Because OG, although they're arguing an intuitive clash, because they're arguing an intuitive clash, they might not spend a lot of time weighing. They will just be engaging with opening opposition. And so that leaves you in a uniquely beneficial position where your weighing would probably be taken on face value and not necessarily OG will not have some justification as to why their thing is most important within the debate besides the intuition that they have. But yeah, that's kind of that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Thank you.
No worries. Do you have any other questions? Well, okay, guys. Thank you. I hope this was helpful. Again, you can go through the exercises